Hey guys, and welcome to World History with Granville County Schools Online. I am Mr. Tobin, the one that most of you have been corresponding with for the class so far. All of you are doing a great job so far. Just make sure that you keep up with your units and the concepts that you have. I saw some people in chat earlier, but now it looks like we have 0 viewers. So I don't know what's on TV right now, but it's obviously a little bit more important than me at this time. But like I said earlier in chat, we are in the announcements in our section of haiku. I will go over a lesson tonight. The lesson will last about 25 minutes. After the lesson is over, if anybody is around, we will take questions, and there's a group chat that you can sign on to chat with in the group chat, or with the link that was given, you can actually sign on and talk back and forth with me. So once again, if you do show up late, I'll have the group chat there, and I'll correspond with you in the group chat at that time. But what I want to go ahead and do is start with the initial lesson, and it stems from Unit 1, and one of the early, well, actually the first couple concepts in Unit 1, which talk about early Southwest Asia, human history, Mesopotamia, and the Fertile Crescent. I'm going to pull up and screen share a PowerPoint right now so that you can see it. Let's see if I can pull it up here. All right, and you should be able to see it right now. So we'll start from the beginning. And obviously it talks about civilizations and empires in Southwest Asia, which was the dawn of civilization for mankind as it's written in written history. Most of you viewed the YouTube videos of Crash Course in World History. You also read some of the summary in the textbook, so you've got some basic knowledge about these civilizations that arose in the Fertile Crescent. One of those that we'll talk about in depth, of course, will be Sumer. When you did your SAS worksheet, the SAS curriculum worksheet, you talked about cities, or you had to list cities such as Sumer, Ur, and then, of course, the famous Babylon, which we'll go into detail about Babylon a little bit later tonight. When you look at this region, of course, this region today is in the Middle East, and most of it is in Iraq, and some of it spans into Iran and Turkey. When you look at some of these cities, if you're a biblical person, a lot of these cities you will see and you'll read about in the Old Testament of the Bible, also in the Old Testament of the Quran, or the older part of the Quran, you will see some of these cities. Some of them, like Nineveh, you may have heard the story of Jonah, and then Assyria, you probably heard about some battles in the older testaments of both these books. One of the reasons that this was called the Fertile Crescent, though, and that is very important and significant to mankind at the time, was because of how it was set up and what was around this area. When you look at the picture, or the map that is depicted on the screen here, you see 2 rivers, one the Tigris and one the Euphrates. Early civilizations had to have one main thing to survive and thrive. And when we look at that, one of the main things that they had to have, of course, was water. So it was very important for them to be centered around the Tigris and the Euphrates, because it gave humans that basic necessity for life that they have to have, which was water. But also the other necessity was food, and to get food, they had to have water to produce it. This led to sort of an agricultural boom, as you can see. It talks about, the bullet point here says, farmers need their villages near water because they need it for their crops. Pretty self-explanatory, but really the main reason why Mesopotamia at the time and the Fertile Crescent was such an important spot for the human growth throughout the world and humankind. Obviously, we talked about, just discussed Mesopotamia being the region between the Tigris River. I think somebody joined. Let's see here. We talked about the region between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River, and of course it was known as Mesopotamia. One of the first villages to emerge, and one of those villages that you'll see a lot when you look at ancient history, you'll hear about it a lot, was Sumer. The villagers were called Sumerians, and like I mentioned earlier, that was one of those cities that you will constantly see in the Old Testament of the Bible or the older versions of the Quran. Let's see. We got Rakaya. Am I saying it right?
Yes.
All right. You are here with us. You are our only viewer right now, Rakaya. I am Mr. Tobin. Let me see if I can get off the screen share, and we'll go back to it as soon as that. Let's see here. We'll stop and present. There you go. So it's nice to meet you or hear you, Rakaya. And we were just going over the PowerPoint. Like I said earlier, before you probably got logged on, you are one of the first to join. So we're talking about Mesopotamia and the region of early human history. How did you feel about that unit and the concepts? Did you feel like you got everything in there?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to continue going through the lesson. And if you have any questions, just stop me, ask in the chat. All right.
All right.
All right. So we'll go back to the screen share. Let's see here. And when we look at the screen share, we were just discussing Sumer as one of the first ancient cities that really comes into existence, that people start to discuss and talk about in ancient history. And Sumer was neither a city nor a country. Let's go back here. It was just a collection of separate cities with a common way of life, and they shared a common culture. If you look here, this is not an actual image of Sumer. You see the ziggurat here, which was one of the famous temples or pyramids at the time, but it was not the actual, this is not the actual image of Sumer. Historians do believe that Sumerians built the world's first civilization, and it really just became a civilization because of the common culture that they shared with other people in that area. And that area is really in the hotbed of Iraq, which if you want to tie in modern times and some of the things that are happening in the modern world right now, I know on the news you hear a lot about ISIS. ISIS has threatened to damage or basically mess up some of these spots that you see here in this image. They've threatened to tear down some ancient artifacts and things that are in the region of Iraq that are very important to the people and the culture of the Middle East. So because of this, this has become a very hot bed item for historians and people to say that's one of the reasons that we need to prevent ISIS from doing these type of things. Now, one of the things that's very important, and it will be very important on the test at the end of this summer session, are the 5 traits that are essential for a civilization. One, to have a civilization, you have to have the growth of cities. And this does not mean just population growth, but you have to have the growths of the areas around the city. So you have to provide a center of trade. You have to have farmers, merchants, traders who bring goods to markets in the cities and who are working in the city. So if you look at modern day cities, one of those cities that would be very significant, one of the largest cities in the, actually the largest city in the United States would be New York City. And you look at how they are in New York City, it's one of the centers of trade. They import and export things from all over the world into New York Harbor. In New York, these things are sold. They're passed along throughout the rest of the country from the dealings that are taking place in New York. So a civilization has to have the growth of cities. There also has to be specialized workers. And what this means is that people have to have particular jobs, and there have to be people throughout the civilization that can do multiple things. If you just have a civilization of all farmers, obviously you're just going to grow the crops, but you won't have anything else done. The farmers won't be able to build the buildings. The artisans won't be able to make the goods by hand. So there won't be that aspect of everybody doing a common goal, or everybody doing a job to get to a common goal, which in this way would be to create the growth of the city and then what leads to a civilization. Now, you also have to have record keeping and writing. Obviously, if we're talking about the civilization of America, we would know that we have the English language. We also have, it's not an official language, but we also have Spanish, which is one of the other languages that's spoken in this country. And there are multiple languages spoken in this country because we are a hotbed for immigrants and for people to come here. It's basically in our history, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you have to have the ability to record keep and write. And so when you talk about these ancient civilizations, you'll see words like scribes and scrolls and papyrus. Papyrus, of course, was the form of paper that was made during this time period. These ancient civilizations, when you look real back, like Sumer, their writing was more cuneiform type, which meant that it was little images, pictures, and things that described the events that were taking place or stories that they were telling. And these were done on stone, in walls. They were also done on stone type tablets. So they had to have an ability to keep records or write. Okay, and there, of course, you see down there at the bottom where it talks about the Sumerians creating the cuneiform system, which is one of the first systems of writing that has ever been found. And then, of course, this would lead to, which people would say today, the writing that was in Egypt of hieroglyphics. Now, if you look at the cuneiform tablet here, its imprints of signs called cuneiform were made by pressing a wedge-shaped stylus into wet clay. Obviously, we don't have a whole lot of ability to read this, and really only scholars today can read it if it hasn't been translated or interpreted. But you can see here that the tablets were created so that they could keep record. Now, a lot of people think that most of the record keeping at that time was to tell stories for religious reasons, for certain aspects of things that were going on, but mainly it was for sale and trade. So when people would come into the city and they would purchase things or they would pay for things, this was sort of like a hard copy of a receipt that they would use at the time. Now there you can see the actual tools that they used to create cuneiform, really an early version of the pencil without the lead, because it's just a small wooden, I guess you would call it, I just always call it a small wooden stake that they would use to write and draw on the cuneiform tablet. Now here is one of the cuneiform translation tables. It's a lot more difficult than it looks here, but you can see that they're actually, the letters correspond with the images or the symbols that you see here. Now some of them, because of the way that they're written, they don't always work out. So if you're ever trying to translate it, it may not work out exactly like it's written here. But this is what scholars and historians have come up with to say that this is the table for translation for cuneiform. And here's the rest of the traits that are essential for civilization. The last two, of course, are two that you know that we also have in America today, which make us an advanced civilization, but it would be advanced technology. And they had to have some form of advanced technology for the civilization to be considered a civilization. Now, the Sumerians obviously didn't have the iPads or the iPhones or things like that, but during the time period of ancient history, they were skilled in science and technology. They invented things such as the wheel, the plow, sailboats, and they also led us into the Bronze Age, which is where they created bronze, a mixture of copper and tin, to create artwork, to create the ability to build different things. So when you look at civilizations, they also have to have advanced technology. And then the last part that a civilization has to have is a complex institution. They have to have an organizational system to run a city. Now, this could mean multiple things. During the ancient times, it could mean that a king ruled the city with elders or priests or people that advised him underneath him, but ultimately he was the monarchy. He had absolute control of the city or the civilization. It can also mean that there was a group of people that potentially controlled the civilization. If you look at America today, we would say that we were a democracy, so the civilization would be controlled by the organization of the people, and the elected people that we elect are put into office, such as the Senate, House of Representatives, and of course the President. So all of these things, and if you take these things and compare them to what America is today, you can see that we do fall into the category of a civilization. All right, let's continue on here. Now, here are the disadvantages of the Fertile Crescent, and some of you wrote about these in your SAS assignments that you had to do for Concept 1, and Concept 2 and Concept 3 during this week. One of the first one was water problems. Because of the way the region was and how flat and how low the region was, there were water problems, and they had a lot of floods. Now, it would flood quickly, but because also where the region was in relative nature to the equator, it would also dry up quickly. So this would cause some problems when it came to the farming and the agricultural aspect of the different regions. What the Sumerians did to solve these problems of the Fertile Crescent was they were the first ones to create irrigation ditches, and these irrigation ditches would take water out of the fields, put it back into a lower area so that it would run off. It's the same thing farmers do today when they're farming in gardens down in the eastern part of the state, or even up in the part of the state where I'm at, which is the Piedmont area, and right in the middle of the state. They'll create these irrigation ditches to run water off and allow the plants to have the ability to grow. One of the second disadvantages, and you wrote about this in one of your summaries that you had, was that there were defensive problems. And if you read some of these biblical stories or stories in the Quran that were happened in ancient history, they talk about some of these areas like Assyria and Babylon, and they talk about how they were protected by big walls because they were very flat. And this region today is still very flat. When we move into the wars that are happening in the Middle East at this time, and also the Operation Desert Storm that happened in the early 90s, you'll see that some of the issues even now, where what was the issue then, was that the defensive problems were they were very flat. There were no natural defensive barriers, which means there were no mountains, forests, things to keep out or prevent raid by nomads. So what the Sumerians did was what we just talked about. They built city walls with mud bricks to discourage raiders, and these walls usually were high to keep these raiders away from the initial part or the most important part of the city. And then obviously, because of this region being more like a desert type region, there were limited natural resources, the lack of resources to create tools, which would be stone, wood, and metal. And we had somebody pop in. Let's see who popped in real quick.
That's not class.
Nah.
All right. All right, we had Tierra join. So we'll go back to the front page here. All right, let's see if we can present back to the screen. Share it. All right. And so we talked about the Fertile Crescent disadvantages that they had with the Sumerian solutions there. Now, from the current slide, we'll keep moving here. And we've got about 15 more minutes, and then I'll open up the floor for any questions that you have about the testing or anything else going on with the class. Some of the Sumerian solutions that are still in use today, and we talked about these a little earlier, but of course the irrigation ditches are still being used, and we use these in America right now. Even in your area, in the Granville County area, you can look at some of the tobacco farms or some of the farms that grow soy or soybeans, and you can see these irrigation ditches because water has to run off somewhere, and the plants can't be soaked in water, or technically it will drown the plants, so they can't grow. So irrigation ditches are still used today. And then of course in the Middle Eastern region, you see the way that they have built their cities. With the building of the cities here, they still use the same mud type building that they had during those early times. Reason being, because of that lack of natural resources that you saw earlier with one of the earlier slides. So they're still having to use those ancient type ways of building to create cities today. If you ever see the Middle East in movies, a lot of times when they show Iraq in the movies, if you've seen like The Lone Soldier or one of the newer movies that's come out where they show Iraq in it, you'll see a lot of the cities that look like this, especially in the northern Kurdish regions, and that's because they lack the natural resources, and unless they have the money support from oil and things like you see in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, they can't build with the natural resources that we have, which would be wood and concrete and things like that. All right, now, one of the main important things that you'll see on the EOC, and the EOC will talk about these in great detail will be the types of religions that existed in the past. Obviously, we know in the world there are multiple religions, and they have different terms for the different types of religions that there are in ancient history and in the world today. One of the terms that will be very important is polytheism. And what polytheism is, it is a belief in many gods. Before the Jewish people created the monotheistic religion with a belief in one God, polytheism was the norm. People in Samaria and Babylon would believe and worship in many gods, so they wouldn't just have that one God. The Sumerians themselves were polytheistic. They believed that their gods were a lot like them, except they were immortal and all-powerful. As we go throughout history, you'll see a theme with this too when we look at the Greeks and the Romans, until the Romans came along with Constantine, because he eventually changed that. But they would talk about how there were multiple gods. And here are some of the gods that they were worshiping at the time. Anu was the god of heaven, Enlil the god of clouds and air, Eo, god of water and floods, and the afterlife. Unlike some Christians today believe in heaven, the Sumerians believed that their souls went to the land of no return, or it's a gloomy place between the earth's crust and the ancient sea. So there wasn't a whole lot of excitement for the afterlife at that time. Now, when you look at these three gods here, and these were three of their most important gods, I want you to pay attention to the things that you see that they were the god of. One was heaven, one clouds and air, one water and floods. The significance with that is you have to see what the people thought was most important at the time. Obviously, for people, they knew that air was important for life. So one of the gods was the god of air, because to them it was important for them to have air. And then the other one, Eo, which was one of their most important, was water and floods. We talked about it earlier in the lesson, but they had to have water to survive. It was a basic, it's a basic necessity for human life, so you have to have water, and with water, of course, you can survive, you can plant plants and grow things and grow crops. So that's why they were significant to the Sumerians at the time. Now, who ruled Sumer? And we talked about this when we talked about what a civilization has to have, but the rulers of Sumer were priests and kings. Priests had power because they knew how to please the gods. According to the average Sumerian, a priest would be someone that would have a direct connection to God at that time, or to the gods at that time. So if there was ever anything going wrong with the crops, with the irrigation, with the entire system, then they would go speak to the priest, and the priest would have that direct connection. Sumerians began by choosing a strong warrior to lead them in battle, and these leaders eventually became kings, and then of course kings like in later history, when we talk about the English and we talk about French and those European countries, the kingdom became an hereditary position, which meant that it was passed down from family member to family member. Mainly, usually in this time period, it would be a male family member. And we discussed social classes in some of your concepts, but mainly it was in the concepts talking about India, when we talked about the Dharma and the different types of social classes and castes that were in the Dharma. If you looked at the social classes in Sumer, there were 4 basic types of social classes. The top would be the priests and the kings. The one underneath would be wealthy merchants. Then artisans and farmers, which were the workers. That would be considered middle class today, or blue collar. And then the slaves. By working obediently day and night, they could hope to earn their freedom. And unlike some of the slavery that we'll talk about later in history, in Sumeria, if the slaves did work hard and they worked obediently, they were given the hope to earn their freedom later on. And one important thing, which we just skipped over it, but it is very important, is that in Sumeria, women actually had more say than they do in other ancient history that we'll talk about later. Now, Sumer's actual downfall, or the downfall of Sumeria, was because of the fighting that was going on in this region, and some of the historical fighting that we talked about would be in the Bible and in the Quran at those times. They were in a region that was so flat and so non-shaded or non-protected by mountains and things like that, that the nomads would come in, they would attack, and it would continually break down the cities. So nomadic raiders in 2000 BC swept through Ur, which was one of the Sumerian cities, and left it in ruins. and thus it was ending one of the last great city-states of Sumer and became the eventual downfall. Now, here is a 1930 aerial photograph that was a ziggurat at Ur, and you can see who took the picture. One of the ancient not ancient, but one of the guys that took it in the 1930s, of course, took this, and this was a building that was in ancient Ur at the time. One thing that's pretty cool, if you get a chance and you go on Google Earth and you look at this area, sometimes you can see areas that have been marked in the desert that were ziggurats or that were cities from Sumer. And because of the technology that we have today with the satellites and things, you can actually see how the city was set up. And so, once again, these are some of the artifacts and some of the things, the buildings and things that are going on today that ISIS is trying to damage and take away because it's a part of ancient history and it's a part of the Iraqi history, and they're trying to do away with it. Here's another photograph of a ziggurat that is in better shape, and this has been partially restored. And this is one of the drawings of the original. Pay attention to how similar, even though it's made on the like a boxy scale, still look how similar it looks like a pyramid when you look at the aspects or the scale of the drawing. Now, here's one of the main turning points in history because of what it did. Around 2000 BC, a group of nomadic warriors known as the Amorites invaded Mesopotamia, and the Amorites established Babylon as their capital city. Babylon is one of the most important ancient cities after Sumer. Their king, Hammurabi, that took power in 1792 to 1750 BC, and notice how in BC the time counts down instead of up like it does today, was a powerful and influential king, and he thought that, or he felt that, Babylon civilization was becoming so complex and people were starting to spread out. There were artisans, farmers, workers that were taking part in building the civilization up. So he felt that there needed to be a set of laws that would help resolve disputes. He created this set of laws, and this set of law code became known as Hammurabi's Code. And some of you may have heard it. You may have heard it in a previous social studies class. But Hammurabi's Code, of course, talks about an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. And Hammurabi said that to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and evil, and to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, to enlighten the land and to further the welfare of the people, we will create these walls. We will create these laws. And there are 282 specific laws dealing with all types of things, mainly situated around family life. 88 of the laws deal with marriage, family, and property. And then the three fundamental principles are principle of retaliation, which, like I just said, was an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. That meant if somebody took an eye from you, you were able to take an eye from them. If they took an arm from you, you were able to take an arm from them. Pretty glad that this isn't one of the disciplinary tactics of today. But there was also the principles of punishment, and double standards did exist between social classes. And this is important to understand, is that if you were part of the wealthy class and you did something wrong, sometimes you could buy yourself out of trouble, basically. And some students this year in class said, well, hey, that still exists today, because sometimes the famous people, the rappers and the artists and the movie stars, they are able to buy themselves out of trouble because of the money and the things that they have, and we can't, just regular old people can't buy themselves out of trouble because we don't have the same means. And then there was also the principle that the government had a responsibility for what occurred in society, because Hammurabi felt like he had a serious responsibility for the welfare and the well-being of his people. Now, of course, he still ruled with an iron fist, but he had that mindset that he had the responsibility. We'll go into another couple groups, and then we'll move on to some questioning if you have any questions to ask me. The Phoenicians were important sea traders. In around 1100 BC, the Phoenicians were sailing around the Mediterranean Sea. There were 300 Phoenician cities that sprouted up around Africa's Mediterranean Sea. The highly prized purple dye for which the Phoenicians were renowned was extracted from a gland of the murex snail, so they actually used the snail to extract the gland that would turn purple, and people loved this purple during that time period and would trade and buy that. And if you look at that, what's pretty crazy is that up to 60,000 snails were needed for each pound of dye that they used, that the Phoenicians used to make their cloths and things that were purple. You can also, the Phoenicians are also play a part in biblical stories and these stories in the ancient Quran. So you may have heard about them before. Some of the sci-fi, I guess you could say, or some of the extreme cases with the Phoenicians were that the Phoenicians actually set up or created the city of Atlantis, which would be then populated by people from Greece. Nobody's proved this to be true. Some other stories were that the Phoenicians actually sailed to America and to South America, so they actually were the first ones to discover America. Once again, these stories haven't been proven to be true, and they're just hypotheses that people have made over time based on some of the artifacts that they've found, in these areas. Now, contribution to one of the main Phoenician contributions will be more like a modern English alphabet that we see today, or a modern alphabet we see they're like we use today in America. And around 900 BC, the Phoenicians developed a writing system with 22 symbols versus the, look at this, 600 symbols in cuneiform. So it went from 600 symbols to 22, and of course the alphabet was born. Now, the last thing we'll talk about before we'll take questions, we discussed polytheism and what polytheism was. Polytheism was the idea that there are multiple gods, and so groups of people or civilizations during that time that were polytheistic worshiped multiple gods. When the Jewish people came along, they changed this idea up. They went from polytheistic to a monotheistic religion. And what that meant was a monotheistic religion was a person who worships one main god. So in the Jewish tradition, it was God. They decided that there was one God, and that was the God that they would worship. The Jews were one of the smallest groups in the Fertile Crescent, but because of their monotheistic beliefs and because of the Bible and the stories that were written in the Bible, their influence on history is huge. One of the main Jewish people that you hear about a lot in history was Moses, and by the law set forth to Moses, God demanded a high standard of moral conduct. This builds off those laws set forth by Hammurabi, where it was an emphasis on justice, morality, and an individual relationship with God. And that's what set Judaism apart, because one, they had one God, while everybody else during this time period had multiple gods, and they set themselves apart by creating the Ten Commandments, or the commandments for how people were supposed to live life. And then once you see here, this idea marked the birth of a set of religious traditions and the impact which lasted for thousands of years and is still taught in churches and things around the country. And then we move on to the Iron Age, but we'll stop this and get back to the main Google screen here and see if anybody has any questions. Let's see. And I see we have, let's see, who do we have with us? We have Rakai still with us, and make sure I'm saying your name right. Emma Tierra?
Yes, sir.
Tierra, all right. Tierra, do you have any questions about any of the units, concepts, things that are going on so far in the class?
No, sir.
Okay. Were you able to take the Unit 1 assessment and the Unit 1 the constructed and selected responses yet?
No, not yet.
Okay. All right. Well, for both of y'all, Rakaya and Tierra, when you do take those assessments, make sure that you understand you can use multiple attempts. So you have more than one shot to take the assessment. If you don't do as well on it the first time, like you thought you should or like you thought you would, you have multiple attempts to take the test. And also, you can feel free to use any resources that you'd like to take the test. So that means you can use concept notes. You can use the videos that we watched. You can use the definitions, and you can also use anything else that you feel like is necessary, which means you could use Google search at that time. So does that make sense?
And this is during the like essentials.
This is
Or
during
to help
the
us
unit.
study for some.
That's right. This is during the unit assessment. So basically, like the test for the unit, you are able to use all those different things. So if you are taking notes with the essential questions, like you don't have to turn the essential questions in, but if you are taking notes with the essential questions, you can use those on the test.
Okay.
You have any more questions?
For question 1 on the constructive response, I didn't really get it, and I had looked it up, and I still didn't get any answers.
All right, and that was the question about the ancient Greece?
Yes.
Okay, what you're looking for with that question is you're looking for their contributions to art, science, and things that go through, that they did throughout history. I think it was concept 4 was the concept that was used, that we talked about, ancient Greece. That may have been 5, but I think it was 4 in the unit. And if you look at that and you look at the summary, there are some of those contributions. That crash course in world history video that was tagged to it with the Greece, it actually has some of those contributions and things that are on there too. So if you need any help with that, there should be on there. And if you have any other questions with it, just feel free to email me, and I can give you some hints about, you know, what is important with it and what were some of the contributions there. And some of the main ones, of course, would be the art and the history that they provided us throughout the rest of history, pretty much. Any other questions?
Is it okay if we get ahead in the class, or would you like us to work at your pace?
No, you are fine to get ahead in the class. If you want to go ahead and continue working through some of the assignments, up until the midterm, which the midterm is going to be pretty much right after July 4th, so it'll be around the July 14th, I think it is, where the midterm is. If you look on the schedule, it says exactly. I will not put out the midterm until that date. So if you get ahead, you can go ahead and do the work for the other chapters, but you won't have the opportunity to take the midterm until that date. So, but yes, you can go ahead. And some of the work will calm down. What I want you guys to understand is I really wanted you guys to get involved in SAS so you understood how to use it. But later on, it will calm down, and we'll go from just doing some definitions and things instead of having a SAS assignment with every concept.
Okay.
So what unit is the what units is the midterm going to be on?
The units the midterm will be on will be the first 4 units. So it'll be the unit on ancient history. It'll go up to go through Roman history, Middle Ages, and then to the Renaissance and Reformation.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
No,
No, sir.
not for me.
Okay. And guys, if y'all have questions at any time, I usually have my phone with me all day, so I'm getting emails all day. And if you email me, I'll respond as quickly as possible. You can also shoot me messages through Haiku, which I know both of you have done so far, so that's totally fine. Just ask away, and if there's some help that you need, I'll provide some hints or some things to lead you in the right direction with those, so that it makes it a little easier on you. As long as you follow along with the videos that we have and the course summaries and you're taking the definitions, you will do fine. What I would do, and I've constantly said this on the announcements, but I would make sure that with the definitions, I keep them all in a Word document or a Google Doc so that I can keep them all together, and then when it comes time for the midterm or it comes time for the EOC at the end of the class period, you have all these definitions to study from. So one of the most important things, I know people have talked about the EQ and the learning goals and things like that, but really the most important thing for social studies and for history is knowing these definitions, because of the most significant people, places, and things that you'll have to know for these tests, okay?
Okay.
Any more questions?
No, sir.
All
I
right.
had said my unit vocabulary though. So.
That's fine. And really, and some of you have gotten ahead on the Unit 1 vocabulary, which is totally fine, but the unit vocabulary, I wanted to give you an ample amount of time to do it, so it's really not due until after every 2 units. So you can do the Unit 1 vocabulary and the Unit 2 vocabulary and then turn it in all together at the end of the 2nd unit. That's why I want you to do it on the same document, so it makes it easier for you guys to keep it all together, and it makes it easier to turn it in at one time instead of having to turn it in multiple times, so that you can get a pretty easy grade on that.
Okay.
All right. All right, guys. Well, if there's no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast. This will be back on Haiku tomorrow in case you want to catch up on any of the lesson. And like I said, if y'all have any questions or you need anything from me, feel free to email me at any time, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. But thank both of you guys for showing up, and hopefully next week we'll get a couple more people in here so we can do some question and answering series and things like that, and then really make it more collaborative during that time period. But once again, thanks, guys, and y'all have a good evening, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
All right.